You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. It was an audacious plan that took years of preparation, training and subterfuge. On the 6th of June 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of northern France, supported by the largest armada of ships ever assembled and thousands of aircraft. Their aim? To liberate Europe from the Nazis.
We did four two and a half hour patrols over here on D-Day. The night before that, we provided cover for parts of the invasion fleet, and we were over the beaches and the shipping off Normandy coast for about 7 o'clock on the morning of D-Day.
That's Australian pilot officer Athol Rice, speaking in Normandy just 5 weeks after D-Day. The old gramophone disc containing this remarkable recording was recently unearthed in the memorial's collection.
It didn't look too comfortable down below there. We could see the shells bursting and the guns crackling away from some of the enemy coastal batteries which hadn't been knocked out. I remember thinking that I'd sooner be up looking down than down looking up. The next day, D+1, we were doing the same job, providing cover over the beaches when those gliders of ours came in. It was a wonderful sight to watch them slide down just where they were wanted. We expected some activity that night, but the Huns wouldn't come up. We did this sort of work for about a week, quite long enough for most of us. I suppose it was important work, but we were all wanting to get over the other side and get cracking from there. Now we are here. We like it. As far as operations are concerned, it's much better than being back in England, chiefly, of course, because we don't have that 90-mile stretch of water to cross every time we go out. The runway is perfect, much better service than our old one back in England. In fact, it's a pretty good life out here. We live close to our aircraft, we get bags of fresh air, and we have a Guy Fawkes display free every night. I'm never going to waste sixpence again buying a box of crackers.
Rice and other members of his number 453 squadron were interviewed by the BBC for a radio series called With the Australian Forces in Great Britain. Here's Warrant Officer Jack Stewart talking about a dogfight he'd been involved in just a few days earlier. He was 22.
We were out on another armed recce. We thought there might be a chance of running into some Huns. We were in the right direction for company. The section which I was in had gone down to shoot up some transport when the CO called up. He said, "Look, chaps, if you cast your eyes upward at about 4 o'clock, you'll see something very interesting." Well, we cast our eyes upwards, and it was certainly interesting. There was a long gaggle of Huns, over 40 of them, ME-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, coming out of some cloud. They came down on us like a waterfall. The CO manoeuvred the squadron and then turned to lead the attack himself. He climbed straight up into the Huns, firing all the time and spraying them with bullets. They'd been planning to attack us, but he broke them up within seconds. We all split up into a whole lot of separate dogfights. I got sort of left on my own and was climbing to join my number 1 when I saw 2 of them go into some cloud. I went on to intercept them and gave one of them the works from about 200 yards. I could see the strikes on his cockpit. He broke away suddenly and half rolled, and I caught him with another burst. His right wing came off and he tumbled down through the clouds. That was my one. Altogether we claimed 3 destroyed, 2 probables and 6 damaged. It was quite a party.
D-Day and the Normandy campaign were a triumph for the Allies of courage, skill, determination and ingenuity. It's not just what people did, it's also what they built. And the memorial has a great example.
We're looking at a late 1940s model of part of the Mulberry harbours.
Shane Casey is Senior Curator of Military Heraldry and Technology. But what were the Mulberry harbours?
The Mulberry harbours were an artificial harbour that was created in pieces all around the coast of England and then towed across the English Channel to the coast of France to allow the armies to be resupplied once they were ashore. The problem with landing on France, on the coast of France, was that there was a huge tidal variation every day, something like 7 metres. And so if you berthed your ship at high tide, when the tide went out, there was something like 900 metres of beach that was exposed, and so you couldn't get your ships off the shore then for ages and ages. And the problem also was that the weather in the English Channel is notoriously terrible, and so you didn't want your ships to be at the mercy of wind and wave. So you had to somehow create this massive artificial harbour, which they did very successfully.
So this was after the initial landing of troops on D-Day. This is when they had to shift huge numbers of men, huge numbers of tanks and other military equipment ashore. So that's how they used these harbours.
That's right. It was one thing to make the initial assault. You could do that, but you could only do that for one day, really. And then they knew that the Germans would counter-attack and they could easily push them off the beaches. So somehow you had to have this fantastic harbour. Now, the problem was that the Allies couldn't capture an existing harbour. There was Cherbourg and Dieppe and Boulogne and Calais and all those places, really heavily defended. And they had tried to attack Dieppe back in 1942 and miserably failed, huge loss of life and everything. But they learnt the lessons, and the lesson was you had to land on a beach somehow and try and pick beaches that were as lightly defended as they possibly could.
The model of the Mulberry Harbour is the centrepiece of the memorial's temporary exhibition about D-Day and the role Australians played. We'll hear more of those individual stories soon. But let's take a closer look at the model. It's so detailed and huge.
So if you can imagine a model that's 5 metres long, if you stretch out your arms, it's probably about 3 times the length of a person with their arms outstretched. And it's a ship with opening bow doors that's about 2 metres long. And then the ship is berthed on a series of piers. These piers are really strange. They have these arms that poke up at each corner, which are called spuds. And the spuds, the idea is that the spuds would go down to the ocean floor, sit on the seabed, and as the tide raised and lowered, or went in and out, the men on board the pontoons would raise and lower the bed of the pontoon.
The model also features tiny trucks, tanks, guns, and of course human figures. So how did it come to be in the memorial's collection?
We're not 100% sure about its origins. All we know is that it came out here at the request of the British Trade Commissioner in 1946, and we think it was probably used for planning and training purposes during the war. It went on display in 1946 at the Adelaide Easter Show. Its history is a bit obscure. It sort of languished here at the War Memorial in pieces until about a month ago. And we've reassembled it now for the first time. No one here at the memorial had ever seen it.
What sort of condition was it in, and what did you have to do to get it on display?
Yeah, when you look at the model, it does look a bit worn. There's paint scuff marks and things, and that's fine. It's 70 years old, but some of the parts were broken. We're missing some of the parts, and we had to recreate them. And so some of the parts were made on my kitchen table. Our conservators made some other parts. We were missing the bow doors on the landing ship over there, but generally speaking, it was in pretty good shape.
How much fun was it to put it back together and to make the new bits and pieces?
Well, I had quite a lot of fun, but my wife said I had to get it out of the house before the cat did something with it, jumped on the table or whatever. So we were glad to see the end of it in the family. But we like to think that this diorama is a continuation of the dioramas that we had in the First World War, where people went out to France and made these wonderful dioramas. This one is using a combination of 1940s technology and models and 2019 technology.
How does this model tell us the story of D-Day?
One thing I think this model shows is the immense planning that was necessary over many years and the ingenuity that people applied to the concept. The idea of artificial harbours isn't by any means a new one. The Romans had the harbour at Caesarea Maritima off the coast of Israel 2,000 years ago, but this was the first time it had ever really been done on an industrial scale. And what it tells you is the determination the Allies had to win the war, to open up the Second Front, to liberate France. All of the commentators are clear that if they hadn't had this as a concept, they wouldn't have gone ahead with the invasion at all. All around the country in England, engineering firms, small, large, were committed to making the parts, and often they would make the parts without knowing exactly what they were or how they were going to be used. So one of the key components that they had were things called Phoenix caissons, and these were big, 200 feet long or 70 metres, concrete floating tubs which could be sunk onto the seabed, and they would create a breakwater to stop the English Channel waves coming in. Well, they made 212 of those massive things. They soaked up enormous quantities of steel and concrete and manpower, but they were all then brought to the south coast, and the great fear was that the Germans would see this and attack them and figure out what was going on. Well, we know that the Germans did reconnaissance flights over these areas, but they didn't seem to, perceive it as a threat. It's one of the great mysteries, really.
And lucky breaks.
And lucky breaks. And we also had a massive deception plan going where we were trying to convince the Germans that we were going to land somewhere close, up in the Pas de Calais, near Boulogne or Calais. And we also had then a phantom army created in England, the Fourth Army, where radio traffic and troop movements and things were fudged to make it look as though there was this massive army that was going to attack. And all sorts of deception plans were undertaken.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. So what was the Australian contribution before, during and after the D-Day landings? It's estimated that 2,500 Australians took part in aerial operations, attacking German coastal artillery batteries, landing paratroopers in France, and providing defence for the invasion fleet. A small number of Australian Army officers were also involved, and around 500 members of the Royal Australian Navy. Senior Curator Shane Casey.
Back in the day, if you were a Royal Australian Navy person or a Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve person, you were often posted to a British ship and you just integrated into the crew. You were part of the King's Navy and saw yourself in that role. And so it's really hard to pinpoint exactly how many Australians were on the Navy side. There were casualties as well. On the actual day of the invasion, there were 13 Australians who were killed, directly involved in Normandy-related operations. But over the course of the preparation and then the subsequent 2 months of consolidation, there were many, many more casualties as well.
One of the Australians who was killed on D-Day was Richard Peary from the Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve.
He was commanding a small landing craft that was adapted to spot German artillery positions and then radio back their positions to the warships offshore. And he was right up close, right inshore, doing his job when he was hit by artillery fire and simultaneously hit a mine, and he was killed on his 24th birthday.
Dick Peary had been a law student and talented footballer. On the day before D-Day, he'd started a letter to his parents and younger brothers back home. He wrote that he was about to sail for the greatest event in the history of the world. The letter, now on display at the memorial, was never finished. Commander Dean Robertson Murray was an Australian naval officer who survived D-Day. He was a sub-lieutenant of a landing craft flotilla, transporting troops across the English Channel. In his oral history recorded in 2004, he describes the lead-up to the invasion.
The whole sea was crowded with ships. There were ships just everywhere. Ships towing landing craft and other landing craft going in between. The whole ocean was crowded out with ships.
Commander Robertson and his men had to deal with rough seas, but were fortunate not to come under attack as they approached the French coastline.
It wasn't a very pleasant run into the beach, but it wasn't a difficult one, really. We were able to pick out our landing spot without any trouble. Visibility was good. The troops we landed were called the assault troops, who were the first to get up the beach. Their task was, of course, just to secure the beach in time for the larger numbers to arrive. We were not under fire at any time. Now, there'd been monstrous air attacks on the beach overnight. We had, behind each flotilla of landing craft, there were destroyers bombarding the beachhead as we approached. And in between the landing craft, there was a whole series of larger landing craft. They were called landing craft tanks. They each carried about 8 tanks. But some of these had been converted to carry rockets. And there were 2 rows of rocket launchers, the whole length of this landing craft, about 100 feet. And these rockets were fired about a mile off the beach. They landed on the sand and cut a swathe up the beach. And you could see they exploded landmines, cleared everything, so that the pathway where the landing craft landed had been cleared by the rockets, and the soldiers went up the beach quite safely.
Over the next few days, Commander Robertson made 2 more runs across the channel and had an unexpected encounter with a fellow Australian.
We got to the beach, landed the soldiers, and I put my foot over the ramp door just so that I could say I'd put my foot into France. And as I was doing this, a man in civilian clothes approached me, and it turned out that he was a reporter from the Melbourne Sun newspaper. He was surprised to learn that I was Australian, but the next day, or the day after, he had an article in the Melbourne Sun which my sister read on her way to work, and that was the first time the family knew that I was anywhere near Normandy.
Ron Prentice was a flight lieutenant with the Royal Australian Air Force. He flew Sunderland seaplanes with British Coastal Command. Just after D-Day, the navigation instruments on his aircraft were removed and installed on tank landing craft due to sail across the channel. He was asked to join the lead ship to navigate through a narrowly cleared minefield to Omaha Beach. In his 2007 oral history, he recounts the experience.
We pulled up practically to sand level. The tanks didn't have to go through water as we landed them. We landed them. We had to stay overnight because we'd had to tow a disabled craft back to England next day. And we went for a walk up the beach and round the amphitheatre of the sand behind. All of it was marked out with white tapes. The mines hadn't been cleared, the landmines hadn't been cleared from it. You could see objects which I'd love to have picked up, but you dare not go outside that area because they were undoubtedly tethered to a mine. So we wandered around, and that evening they had duckboards put on the sand, and they were going to put on a show for us. Lights had been erected, and so we all assembled there and sitting around the sand in the amphitheatre overlooking these duckboards, and Sadler's Wells ballet girls from England had been brought over to put on a demonstration of ballet for the troops. Now, there were pretty tough commando troops and naval men and everything else there that didn't like me. I'd never seen ballet. I'd never seen a girl's legs at close quarters. I'd never seen a tutu. I didn't know what ballet was. But I'll tell you what, they put on a show that was suitable for the troops. One particular incident there, the first one was a little girl. She'd been no more than 5 foot in a tutu. And she had to walk what was supposedly a tightrope on the duck boards. So she started out along this tightrope. She got to the end of it and she wiggled her tail. Well, that brought up a cheer from everybody there. Then she had to turn around and walk back on the supposed tightrope. That was the type of show we watched. It wasn't until after the war and I came home, I met my future wife, and she couldn't understand meeting an airman that loved ballet. But I'll guarantee there wasn't a man watching that ballet that night that didn't love ballet for the rest of his life. It was a wonderful show.
Who would have thought it? Let's hear now from one of the few Australian Army officers who took part in Operation Overlord, the code name for the Battle of Normandy. Major Henry Gullett, Joe as he was known, landed on the beach at Normandy at around dawn on D-Day and served as a company commander until he was wounded 3 weeks later. This oral history was recorded in 1993.
The little landing craft that were on the decks and were lowered into the sea when we were a mile or so offshore. It was pretty damn rough in them, and some of the men weren't very sick. But excitement, you see, there was so much concentration. We could see the shore ahead. We could hear this tremendous barrage from the British ships of war. These tremendous shells flying overhead. A very impressive noise. Furthermore, the air was full of Allied aircraft. So the noise as we landed was stupendous. It was a very great day in the history of the world, you see. We thought then, and I think we still think it's the greatest thing we ever did.
D-Day was one of the most dramatic events in history. The Normandy campaign was the start of the end of war in Europe, and thousands of Australians risked their lives to be there. Curator Shane Casey.
D-Day is often thought not to be an Australian story, but we know that many, many Australians were involved. And not only that, it's a world story, really. It heralded the liberation of France. It freed up all the resources of France to allow the war to be continued. It freed this, the massive, beautiful country of France from totalitarianism, and helped take some of the pressure off the Eastern Front as well. But when you read the diary accounts of these people, they knew that they were involved in a great, not just an adventure, but something really worthwhile. And I think these days, much of society is so vacuous that it's really heartening, I think, to look back and see what participation in such an event meant to these people. How noble it was for many of them. I think it's really quite touching and it's inspirational.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.